Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who would later be known by the name Lenin, was born on April 22, 1870, in the city of Simbirsk, which is now called Ulyanovsk, in Russia. He was born into a well-educated family. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, was a school inspector and a loyal servant of the Russian Empire. His mother, Maria Alexandrovna, came from a cultured family of doctors and intellectuals. Lenin grew up in an environment that valued education, discipline, and loyalty to the state. His family belonged to the middle class, but his parents ensured that all their children received proper schooling and were raised with strong values of study and hard work. The young Lenin was an outstanding student. He excelled in academics, especially in Latin and Greek, and showed signs of sharp intelligence early on. But his life changed drastically when tragedy struck the family. In 1887, when Lenin was only 17, his older brother Alexander Ulyanov was arrested and executed by the Russian authorities for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The death of his brother shook Lenin deeply and marked a turning point in his life. Although his family wanted him to continue a stable career in law or academics, Lenin grew increasingly drawn toward revolutionary ideas. Despite his family background, Lenin began questioning the absolute power of the monarchy and the suffering of peasants and workers under the Russian Empire. He was expelled from Kazan University for participating in protests against the Tsarist regime. However, this did not end his pursuit of knowledge. He continued to study independently, reading the works of Karl Marx and other radical thinkers. Over time, Lenin became convinced that Marxist ideology was the key to overthrowing the injustices of the Russian system. In 1891, Lenin completed his law degree as an external student at St. Petersburg University and began practicing law. But his real interest was in political activism. By the early 1890s, he was heavily involved in Marxist circles and spreading revolutionary ideas among workers. In 1895, he helped form the Union for the Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class, a group that sought to mobilize industrial workers in Russia. The Tsarist authorities soon arrested him, and he was exiled to Siberia for 3 years. During this exile, Lenin married Nadezhda Krupskaya, a fellow revolutionary, and continued writing and developing his ideas. After completing his exile, Lenin traveled to Western Europe, where he spent much of his time organizing revolutionary groups, writing books, and debating strategies for revolution. He lived in Switzerland, Germany, and London at various times, becoming one of the leading Marxist thinkers outside Russia. It was during this period that he adopted the pseudonym Lenin, a name that became synonymous with revolution. Lenin became a key figure in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but internal disagreements led to a split. In 1903, during a party congress, Lenin's faction became known as the Bolsheviks, while his opponents were called the Mensheviks. Lenin believed in a tightly organized party of professional revolutionaries who could lead the working class to overthrow the Tsarist state, while the Mensheviks favored a broader and more democratic movement. This division would shape the future of Russian politics. The 1905 revolution in Russia, which erupted after the massacre of peaceful protesters in what became known as Bloody Sunday, gave Lenin hope that the Tsarist regime could be overthrown. Although the revolution failed, it convinced him that the Russian masses could rise against oppression. He spent the next decade preparing for such an opportunity, writing influential works such as What Is to Be Done and spreading his vision of a disciplined revolutionary party. World War I became the final blow to the Russian monarchy. The war devastated the Russian economy, caused millions of casualties, and created widespread hunger and unrest. Lenin, who was in exile in Switzerland, saw this as a chance to strike. He argued that the war was an imperialist conflict that sacrificed ordinary workers and peasants for the benefit of ruling elites. In 1917, after the February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, Lenin returned to Russia with the help of Germany, which hoped that his presence would destabilize the Russian government. Upon his return, Lenin rallied the Bolsheviks with his famous April Theses, in which he called for peace, land, and bread. He urged the immediate end of Russia's participation in the war, the transfer of land to peasants, and the establishment of Soviet power through councils of workers and soldiers. His message resonated with the suffering masses who had lost faith in the provisional government that replaced the Tsar. By October 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks organized a coup that became known as the October Revolution. They seized control of Petrograd and declared a new government led by the Bolsheviks. This marked the beginning of Lenin's rule. The provisional government collapsed, and the world witnessed the birth of the first communist state in history. Lenin became the leader of Soviet Russia, and his vision for transforming society was about to be tested. Vladimir Lenin consolidated his rule after the October Revolution of 1917, and the years that followed marked both the establishment of the Soviet state and the deep contradictions of his leadership. Once in power, Lenin moved quickly to withdraw Russia from the First World War. In March 1918, his government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, which ended hostilities but came at a heavy price. Vast territories of the Russian Empire, including Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, were ceded to German control. While the treaty was seen as a betrayal by many Russians, Lenin argued it was a necessary sacrifice to preserve the revolution and rebuild Russia. His focus was not on nationalism but on securing the survival of the new socialist order. Soon after, Lenin faced the outbreak of the Russian Civil War, a brutal conflict between the Bolsheviks, who became known as the Reds, and their opponents, the Whites, who consisted of monarchists, liberals, and other anti-communist forces. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, sent troops and aid to the White armies, hoping to crush Bolshevism in its infancy. The Civil War devastated Russia, leading to famine, disease, and the deaths of millions. Yet under Lenin's leadership, the Red Army, commanded by Leon Trotsky, managed to overcome the scattered White forces. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had consolidated power, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was formally established. Lenin stood as its first leader. During the Civil War, Lenin introduced the policy of war communism, which gave the state total control over the economy. Private trade was banned, food from peasants was requisitioned by force, and industries were nationalized. While the policy allowed the Red Army to continue fighting, it caused immense suffering among civilians. Grain shortages led to widespread famine, particularly in the Volga region, where millions perished. The brutality of war communism highlighted the contradictions of Lenin's rule, as his vision of a workers' state often translated into harsh measures imposed from above. Once the Civil War ended, Lenin recognized the need to stabilize the country. In 1921, he introduced the new economic policy, or NEP, which temporarily allowed a degree of private trade, small businesses, and incentives for peasants to produce more food. This policy improved living conditions and revived parts of the Russian economy, but it was also a retreat from pure socialist principles. Lenin justified it as a temporary step to strengthen the state until socialism could be fully realized. Lenin's rule was also marked by suppression of political dissent. Opposition parties were banned, newspapers were censored, and secret police known as the Cheka carried out arrests, executions, and labor camp deportations of those deemed enemies of the revolution. Intellectuals, clergy, and political rivals faced harsh persecution. The Red Terror, as it became known, was justified by Lenin as necessary to protect the revolution, but it created a climate of fear and established a model of authoritarian rule that would persist long after his death. Despite his harsh methods, Lenin was admired by many for his vision and determination. He sought to spread revolution beyond Russia, encouraging uprisings in Europe, though most of these efforts failed. Internationally, Lenin became a symbol of Marxist revolution, inspiring communist movements worldwide. Domestically, he emphasized education, literacy, and health reforms, attempting to modernize Russian society even while enforcing strict political control. By 1922, Lenin's health began to decline. He suffered a series of strokes that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. During his final years, Lenin became increasingly concerned about the future of the Soviet Union. He criticized the growing power of Joseph Stalin, who had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, warning that Stalin was dangerous and should be removed from his position. However, Lenin's warnings were ignored after his death. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin died at the age of 53. His death marked the end of an era but the beginning of another, as Stalin soon rose to power, shaping the Soviet Union in ways that even Lenin had not envisioned. Lenin's body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square, where it remains to this day, becoming a symbol of Soviet ideology. The legacy of Lenin is deeply contested. To his supporters, he was the man who ended centuries of monarchy and feudal oppression, who gave power to workers and peasants, and who stood firm against imperialism. To his critics, he was a ruthless revolutionary who replaced one form of tyranny with another, laying the foundation for decades of authoritarian rule. His policies saved the revolution but at immense human cost, as millions died from famine, terror, and war during his rule. Lenin's vision of a global workers' movement inspired revolutions and left-wing politics around the world for much of the 20th century. Yet his methods, ruthless suppression of opposition, reliance on secret police, and centralization of power also established a pattern that defined the darker side of communist regimes. Even today, Lenin remains one of the most polarizing figures in history, remembered both as a revolutionary idealist and as the architect of a system that would dominate half the world for decades.